one of the key threads, and we just heard this from Secretary of State Blinken earlier this week, was the myth of the generous offer. Well, the Palestinians walked away in 2000. They were offered this generous offer in 2000, and that destroyed the peace process. And so, really, all this goes back to 2000. And had they just accepted, everything would be better now. And it's a remarkable way to approach diplomacy. It's a remarkable way to approach the peace process because you make it sound like diplomacy is a take it or leave it
Right.
sale, right? Of like you're selling mattresses, right? If you don't buy this car today, the deal is off, right? And we'll never return to this. It's never available to you again. That's not the way diplomacy works, right? And that it's so disingenuous. And this is not the way negotiations achieved, right?
All right. I'm talking to Professor Osamah Khalil. He is a historian of U.S. foreign relations and the modern Middle East. He's the author of America's Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise, and the Rise of the National Security State. And just recently now, the book A World of Enemies, America's Wars at Home and Abroad from Kennedy to Biden. So Dr. Khalil, thank you so much. I'm really, really grateful to be able to talk to you today.
No, happy to be here. Thanks for doing it.
So, A World of Enemies, the way I would describe it to my audience, is a thorough, detailed, oriented history of American foreign policy from the Vietnam War until today. And it's done with a level of like rigor and precision and care. And despite the fact that that would sort of sound maybe um, like dry, there's something sort of riveting and jarring about it. Um, there's very little I felt like editorializing. I don't sort of hear you so much as I hear like a historian speaking. I don't feel anything. I don't feel like the intrusion of like a subjective voice, but it still has this powerful impact, which left me shook. I would say so. It was really an intense reading experience. So yeah, it's exciting to be able to review it with you.
Well, that's very kind of you. I appreciate that. That was what I was going for. So I'm glad it was achieved. But thank you for saying that.
And yeah, I guess one of the major themes that comes across is despite being covering a lot of ground and a lot of content, there are connections, there are parallels and relationships between episodes. And so one example of that is the consistent parallels you draw between America's foreign policy and its domestic policy. The way over the years there's been this evolution, the way we think about our enemies, the way we think about drugs, the way we think about our inner cities, and the way we police abroad and at home, and just sort of seeing the way in which these things are intertwined and related, I think is another element of insight, which is really really powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things I was really hoping would get across to the audience is we tend to think of these as separate and distinct, the domestic sphere and the foreign policy sphere. And what I really wanted to show is how interwoven and intermeshed they've become and to where we are today. And I think that's, really quite evident where we sit now in May 2024, as you have campus protests and the use of militarized policing to deal with dissent, and how much this also echoes where the book begins in the 1960s in the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. And so we can see a number of these, the failure to learn some of the lessons of the past, the manipulation of history. I think we saw a little bit of that in President Biden's recent, speech talking about the protests on campus and how he described them. And you can almost hear President Johnson, talking about the anti-war demonstrators or Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, very much what we heard in the 1960s about outside agitators. And what they meant by that was that this was communist inspired, right? That this was the Soviet Union inspiring the anti-war protests. And now we're hearing that it's, coming from abroad, that it's probably Hamas or it's Iran or any other nefarious actor who's attempting to, inspire these protests. So what I really wanted to get across, and I'm glad you got it, and I think it's great, is that these are not unique spheres. They are interlinked, and in fact, domestic politics and policy have influenced foreign policy, and we can see how foreign policy has also come home.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting that a book that takes us to the present day, that takes us to the Biden administration, starts at Vietnam. And I was wondering, maybe we can look at the epigraph you have in the prologue of your book. You have a quote from a name which is like hard for me to pronounce, Viet Nguyen or something like that.
Nguyen, yes, Professor Nguyen at USC. So he is this amazing scholar. In fact, some of your listeners may actually know he has a wonderful fictional memoir, right, called The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It's just been turned into an HBO series, and this is from his nonfiction book. And so I think it really sets the stage for the book about the role of war in American life and how much Vietnam has has influenced how profound a role war plays today in American life. But I'll turn that back over to you.
Do you want to? I can read it. Would you like me to read it? Unless you
Yeah,
have it
that'd
in
be
front of
great.
you,
Yeah,
I'll read it, and then yeah, we could see what this because when I read it, I it felt like I didn't necessarily grasp everything he was trying
Mm,
to communicate. So maybe we'll see what that is. So he says,
sure.
"quote Invocation of Vietnam as quagmire, syndrome, and war speaks neither to Vietnamese reality nor to current difficulties in Iraq and Afghanistan. It speaks to American fear. Americans think that defeat in these wars is the worst thing, when winning in Iraq and Afghanistan today only means more of the same tomorrow. Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, and so on. This is the most important reason for Americans to remember what they call the Vietnam War, the fact that it was one conflict in a long line of horrific wars that came before it and after it. This war's identity, and indeed any war's identity, cannot be extricated from the identity of war itself. Can you reflect on that?
Sure. And I think there's the knee-jerk reaction, right? I think it may be difficult for those, especially for a younger group of listeners or college students who were very young or not born yet when the Iraq War started and very quickly turned into a quagmire. And you would see bumper stickers, things that would say things like, Iraq is Arabic for Vietnam, right? And what I think Professor Nguyen is really discussing, and it connects to the epigraph I have in chapter one from Martin Luther King, which is about that this is really reflects on the American soul, right? That the role of war in the American soul and what it's done to define American society. And in this case, we often think, and this is what's repeated by several different presidents that I discuss in the book when we come, whether it's Vietnam or later, that defeat in Vietnam would be this enormous tragedy, right? That what it would do to the United States and its standing in the world would have profound implications. And then it turned out that that was incorrect. In fact, that was grossly overstated. And then what we've seen is that same replication across other conflicts, whether it's defeat in Afghanistan or Iraq or Gaza today. What does defeat mean? What does it mean for a country to be constantly at war? Whether it is these domestic wars I talk about and how they connect to the foreign conflicts. And of course, by the time at the end of the book, by when we look at the war on drugs and the war on terror, they are both being fought abroad and fought at home. So there's, I think what Professor Nguyen and this is why I found that quote so compelling is that he's really asking us to look deep inside the American soul and say what does war mean to us and why is it such a defining feature of our lives?
Mm, that's interesting. And also like this question of, winning and losing, like you said,
Right.
what are the stakes of the war? And even what is it? What's the victory of winning in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan? What is
Oh,
that?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about what victory in Vietnam would have looked like, and this is, by the time you get to the Nixon administration, there's this very interesting moment. Okay. So Nixon is going to come in after the 68 election, and he has campaigned on a honorable end to the war, peace with honor, I shall discuss it. And there are those who believe that maybe Nixon is going to kind of wind down the war. And then they find out, and this includes Daniel Ellsberg, who ends up leaking what become known as the Pentagon Papers. And what Ellsberg were later write about is some of his interactions with the incoming National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, who he knew from Harvard and from his role in the government when Kissinger was serving as a consultant. And there'll be a discussion about potential options. And one of the things Kissinger will say to him is, Ellsberg has prepared this paper on behalf of the Rand Corporation, this, semi-autonomous think tank. It's funded heavily by the Pentagon, but it's supposed to be independent thinkers. And that's where Ellsberg is based. So they've done this assessment of the war and where it stands by January of 68 or January 69, rather. And Kissinger will say something to the effect of, "I don't see a win option here." Right. And Ellsberg will walk him through why there is no win option. And he says to him, at one point, even he says, the United States could use nuclear weapons, but I don't see that as a win option. To use nuclear weapons would be an ultimate example of defeat against a country that is, largely agrarian, is very poor. The fact that you would need to do that and then declare victory would in itself be not just a moral loss, but would really kind of show how empty American power really is. One of the other threads, and I think to connect to that is this idea of defeat in these conflicts is also linked to perceptions of American decline, right? And that is a consistent thread that runs through the book and runs through from this period, really right after post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, this idea that the American dream is over, right? That America's standing in the world has declined so much. Connected with it is, of course, not just the idea of its foreign policy status, its political status internationally, but its economic status. And so what we'll often see is this kind of one of the threads that runs through is from the 1970s to the Donald Trump presidency and beyond, even today, right? The fact that the American dream is no longer what we once thought it was. The American dream of our parents and their parents before them is no longer achievable, and a deep dissatisfaction with the way Americans think about the future and think about America's place in the world, and this connection to this idea that the United States is in decline, and that runs through, and I trace that out through several key moments to where we are today.
Yeah, and I also think of, Nazi Germany when they were, dealing with hyperinflation and a sense of, failure of their diplomatic leadership and a disdain for democracy. And it's almost as like imperialism and war can be a way of, giving some sort of psychological, I put like a psychological role in dealing with a sense of decline or a sense of social and political failure.
And I think that's a wonderful point. I think one of the things that this book tries to connect to is works by other historians. So one in particular, when we think about the role of imperial violence and imperial adventurism, is the role of war within empire. How much that is a such a key factor economically and politically. So, for example, a great book is Empire of Guns by Priya Satie at Stanford, and it's an amazing telling about the role that war played in the British Empire and in the Industrial Revolution itself, right? So this idea of gun production, um, and the production of weaponry, and connected to these imperial adventures abroad, the British, and how much that not only defined the British Empire, but also the Industrial Revolution. And then we can see that with the United States as we look at, what's often not recognized is the United States has been the major arms producer from the 1920s to today, right? So it is the major arms exporter. This is what in effect helps drive not just the U.S. economy, but of course global arms sales, and it far eclipses anybody, even remotely close, any other country or countries combined, in terms of the amount of weapons the United States sells. And so when we look at, for example, some of the current debates, including the recent bill that was just signed, to send aid to Ukraine and Israel, part of the rationale was this aid comes back home, right? I mean, so when the Wall Street Journal is publishing articles that sound like the Biden administration, it should tell you something, right? The Wall Street Journal rarely, if ever, agrees with the Biden administration, and yet on this factor, it was very important that yes, our military aid is really about jobs programs back home. So we can see directly this connection between our wars abroad and our wars at home, and the economic role that that plays.
Yeah, and so I guess people who benefit directly, like you said, from jobs and the yeah, I guess what was it Eisenhower called the military industrial complex.
Right.
Um, but I guess to other people, it's also just invisible. Like it's just if they might not benefit, they don't see the cost of, I guess, funding the world's supply of arms. They just don't feel any loss if
I think that it's a great point. It's become cliche to talk about the military industrial complex, but that's because it's become so embedded in American society and American life. We don't think about Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, but they're everywhere, right? And the other aspect I think that's really important is how much that influences how the discourse is shaped. So if you look at where the major military contractors, they also fund, of course, you know, academia. They're present at major jobs fairs and from universities. You can find halls at key universities named, Raytheon Hall, et cetera. They also fund key think tanks. And so even when they're not doing it, you'll find a number of U.S. partners and allies who are also funding money into think tanks. And then, of course, what we see is kind of this replication of these ideas when the think tank experts, publish op-eds or think pieces, when they're in the media, often kind of repeating much of the same rationale. So it's something I dealt with in the first book, and it carries over into the second book, is one, how think tanks have come to predominate, but the role they play in defining and shaping our discourse about what foreign policy options are available.
Hmm.
We saw that, including most recently now with the war in Gaza and how extended to Yemen. So once the U.S. started launching airstrikes against Ansar Allah, the Houthi movement in Yemen, you saw in Foreign Policy magazine, for example, an article that airstrikes were the least bad option. So one of the key things I try and deal with in the book is that we've so enervated diplomacy in the United States that invariably the military option is considered first, is often considered again the least bad option rather than diplomacy being the least bad option. And of course, what was shown with the Houthis, and this should have been known after 6 to 7 years, as I talk about in the book, of the U.S. supporting the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis and failing to defeat the Houthis and turning them from kind of a ragtag militia into this battle-hardened militia. And now, where we are now, where they are the de facto government of Yemen and able to challenge the world's strongest navy, uh, that what we've seen is, in fact, this over reliance on military force and the lack of emphasis on diplomacy serves not only to entrench conflicts, but often has a negative impact. And so that's exactly where we are today.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot to continue sort of with this thread. I mean, I think there's, just when there's racism and ignorance, and I think those two things are deeply, deeply, deeply linked. It's just so easy to celebrate America's military might abroad. I mean, I remember images from, CNN, just in awe and uh, fawning over the images of bombs, like just awful
Yeah.
stuff like that, which again, I think just reflects a deep, deep ignorance or a deep, deep racism. And again, I don't think those things are too easy to disentangle.
They're easy. They're difficult to disentangle, and I connect them in the book. Also, this role of race, notions of racial and religious supremacy, especially one of the things the book really focuses on is America's role in what we now call the global South, but during the Cold War was the Third World or the developing world. So tracing that through from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era, the role of racial supremacy, religious supremacy, and how that often plays out is it plays out domestically in how we look at minorities, particularly minorities in urban areas, and how we look at others abroad. And so that othering and the connection to kind of the civilizational discourse, as I describe it in the book, is a thread that runs right through from Vietnam to the present day. You can see it, for example, one of the popular memes that ran around, as the U.S. was beginning airstrikes against the Houthis, was the Houthis are about to find out why we, the United States, don't have universal health care, right? And so it's kind of
Mm,
this kind of running joke that went through. And in fact, both they have found out why we don't have universal health care, and Americans have found out why we don't have universal health care. And in fact, what we have now, and that was actually really demonstrated, quite frankly, with the COVID pandemic. And I kind of end the book on that note that for all of this military might and military supremacy that the United States has, we proved ourselves completely incapable of dealing with a global pandemic, one that we had been preparing for and should have been better prepared for. And then when it happened, proved ourselves utterly incapable of dealing with both, from a political aspect, from a public health aspect. And it really kind of revealed kind of the shallowness, if you will, of military supremacy.
yeah. So there's so many lessons in Vietnam, and the book I think explores that. One lesson which is on my mind today is the role of student protests and the fact that I think student protests are often on the vanguard of morality in a positive way, and the language which is used to delegitimize them, which we talked about, or you already mentioned in the beginning of our conversation today, and the rhetoric and and all that. But a question which just sort of comes to my mind and it shocks me when reading that history and sort of I struggle how to make sense of is how do you think about again, something you mentioned already in this conversation, that Nixon campaigned on trying to roll back the war in Vietnam, and that there just seems like the this like, usually I my bias tells me that politicians are more or less transparent about what they intend to do. Was that a straight up lie? Was there something else going on there?
So Nixon, true to his word, true to his reputation, rather, as Tricky Dick,
Tricky Dick, yeah.
never actually said he was going to roll back the war, right? What he implied was that he had a secret strategy to end the war, and that there would be, and he promised peace with honor. He promised a honorable end to the war. So what that left was a question mark, among the public, was what does he plan to do, right? So if you were against the war, you could tell yourself, well, maybe, and because he's a Republican, um, he's not tied to this Democratic war, okay, Kennedy and Johnson's war, in particular Johnson's war. If you were a Republican, one of the things he was banking on, Nixon that is, was his reputation as a hardline Cold Warrior, right? And so I'm going to end this war, right? And that's another way you can think about the way he was able to appeal to different audiences and their hopes. One of the ideas that runs through also for Democrats is that you had two candidates who in some ways were not campaigning on escalating the conflict, but trying to find a way out of the conflict. So both Vice President Hubert Humphrey and then former Vice President Nixon. So you could understand why there may have been some decision, especially after the Tet Offensive, which comes into the 68 in the middle as the 68 is beginning, and then at the height of the 68 campaign. You can understand how a number of people on the ground now, at the same time, much like you're seeing today. So that's why 68 is a really important moment to think about. Um, is that the Democratic Party base, the student activists, are completely opposed to the war, right? So you're seeing this in the students, you're seeing this in the large anti-war protests. The establishment, however, has not bought in. What they may disagree with, in fact, and this is one of the challenges when we think about Vietnam, is criticism about Johnson about the war was often, and we saw this again with George W. Bush with Iraq, was how it was being handled. So when you looked at the polling could be deceptive. You had individuals who didn't think Johnson was going far enough, wanted more force used. And then you had those who were like, no, we need to end the war. So then you have and then the fungible middle, right? So what's interesting about Nixon in 69, by the time he comes in, is he's going to try several different approaches, none of which work. Okay. Everything from escalation to what becomes known as the madman theory, which Donald Trump will try. And so the madman theories I talk about in the book was I'm going to try and threaten and behave irrationally, relying on my reputation as this hardline Cold Warrior to basically frighten and intimidate North Vietnam and Moscow, the Soviet Union. And that doesn't work. In fact, when the secret bombing campaign of Cambodia begins, one of the things that North Vietnamese don't do is respond publicly. So they know what's going on, obviously, because it's quite clear that Cambodia is being bombed. The White House hasn't announced it, but North Vietnam doesn't take the bait. And so basically they allow the United States to continue the secret bombing campaign in advance of the open invasion. And when the open invasion happens, then you see kind of it's this spark that just one, it's compounded by the killings at Jackson State and Kent State University for protesters. But something like 20% of university campuses will shut down in protest of the killings at Jackson State and Kent State and the invasion of Cambodia. So it'll reinvigorate the anti-war movement. And it really also kind of brings the lie that Nixon was hoping to kind of de-escalate the war, even though he's already announced, for example, the quote unquote Vietnamization, which is another one of the threads that runs through the book about how those examples from Vietnam, things we should have known, and it's not just we, but the key advisors. And I think what's also important about Vietnam to kind of to bring this point home is so many young people inspired by John F. Kennedy and his inauguration speech will go into government service, right? Foreign service, CIA, the military. And Vietnam will be their big test case. And so I trace some of those individuals out. And one of the things that they will all talk about especially by 73, 74, 75, is one, what are some of the lessons of Vietnam? Lessons they hope will be learned, lessons they fear will be learned, And then as they continue on in government service, what they will find is that they themselves don't apply these lessons. So they often take the wrong lesson away from this. Takes us back to the epigraph at the beginning of the book, which you will find individuals who the lesson they get from Vietnam, and particularly these are some individuals in CIA or in the Pentagon, is we didn't use enough force. That we didn't use enough force. The politicians intervened. We weren't ruthless enough. And so they will try and apply that in different conflict zones in and around the third world, particularly in Latin America, sometimes in the Middle East. Um, Others, as I trace it through, by the time even we get to Afghanistan after 9/11, someone like Richard Holbrooke will basically say the only thing that's similar between Afghanistan and Vietnam is the policies still don't work, right? These policies to develop and improve still don't work. And so, kind of the utter failure of counterinsurgency and development that is exposed both in Vietnam and in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I was thinking also back to the 2016 election where it felt like a lot of the rhetoric among Trump supporters, because he was such a strange, unusual candidate and he was such a chameleon, and people could sort of imbue in him whatever they wanted, was a kind of an anti-war Republican candidacy, which yeah, harken back, I think, to some of this, being able to play both sides of the fence political rhetoric. Um,
And I think one of the things I deal with this a little bit in the book is that Trump, I think this idea of him as the chameleon is a really good one, because Trump is going to, he's basically going to try and combine Nixon and Reagan, right? So he this idea, and he even says, I mean, he gives a speech, and I talk about this, his foreign policy speech, in which he says it's going to be a realist view of foreign policy, that we're not going to be involved in these forever wars with no way to get out. And then when he comes into office, he instead adopts kind of the Nixon idea of we're going to do the combination of the madman theory and escalation. But then, to his credit, and almost in a Nixonian way, after escalating for 3 years in Afghanistan, he signs a peace treaty. And of course, what he signed had been available. And in fact, better options were available, as I talk about in the book, to the Bush administration, to the Obama administration, so that by the time Trump does it, and in fact, the way he does it is it's not so much as reminiscent of what Nixon does in Vietnam, because you could argue Nixon actually gave more protections to the South Vietnamese government and with the Paris Peace Accord than Trump did to the Afghan government, but very similar.
yeah. And I guess maybe wrapping this up a little bit on this chapter of Vietnam, because we've dwelled on this for a while, but like for me, one of the biggest lessons is this racist, I would say, ignorant instinct that's so popular and it's so prevalent today that you could just bomb your enemies and they will submit and they will say, "You're right, we were wrong," or they will turn on their leaders because you bombed them enough. And it just seems like an idea which is so ingrained, and it's so obviously not true, because if you use a modicum of imagination and you just
Yeah.
imagine yourself on the other side of those bombs, you you would just hate the people. You would
Right.
hate them more. You would never just submit. It doesn't make any sense, and it's
It,
such a
what's
common idea.
Well, and I think it's a great point. I think what's remarkable about it, in fact, is that even the planners of the bombing campaigns in Vietnam knew from their World War II experience. You can trace this from I'm often asked, why did you begin with Kennedy instead? It's like, well, for key reasons. One was this issue of decline rather than um, focusing on American primacy. But the World War II experience taught them something when they looked at the bombing surveys, for example, of Nazi Germany, was that they never broke the morale of the population. In fact, so they knew this, and yet instead, in North Vietnam, what the idea was, and they will literally say this: make the North beg for peace. We're going to bomb them enough that they will agree to surrender. They will agree to peace on our terms. And so then you see that replicated throughout. You see it with Iraq in 2003 in shock and awe. You see it today in Gaza. It is this common thread that we can one with this over reliance on air power and this over reliance on military force will actually lead to concessions on the ground. And I talk about several different examples where that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, and I just think, yeah, it's just a little bit of I don't know, imagination. I think you make it fairly obvious that it's
Well,
not the case.
but part of it's also that again, the racism role is important. Where if you look at kind of the derogatory way in which the Vietnamese were viewed, when they were viewed at all, the idea that they can't stand up to the United States, Henry Kissinger will have a line or something like, "I can't believe that a third-rate power like North Vietnam doesn't have a breaking point," right? And that's almost precisely what you're hearing in every conflict sense. How have they not broken yet, right? And so one is about this idea, and of course, one of the issues also is as American technology has improved, quote unquote, the smart bombs. Remember, in Vietnam, we weren't using the quote unquote smart bombs. Um, and it turns out that they're not that smart anyway. In fact, this we find this out again and again, including in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Um, that somehow this idea, one, it gives us comfort back home because, oh, well, they're smart bombs. So they're not killing children. They're not killing people, right? They're killing the bad guy soldiers that we have demonized in the press. They're killing, Saddam's henchmen, etc. So we don't see the bodies, right? Because we've told ourselves these are smart bombs, so they can't go wrong. I talk about this also with the drone campaign, for example, and that Obama and Bush deploy. And so that gives us comfort. And then we have this idea that, of course, because we have such overwhelming force and such a strong military, that we will be able to be victorious. And then, of course, when we're not, and again, as I talk about in the book, it kind of leads back to this, this existential distress about what does this mean for America if we can't dictate terms? What does it mean if we can't win on the battlefield?
Mhm. Maybe we think for a second about like the philosophy of foreign policy, or the way in
Sure.
which foreign policy can be approached as like a inquiry. So I'm maybe a little bit familiar, and maybe some of the viewers are, with the sort of this idea of like a realist
Yeah.
uh, foreign policy program, which I think Kissinger is associated with, and
Right.
this guy John Mearsheimer, who's
Right.
does I haven't read his books, but he's been on podcasts and stuff. And I guess part of this question is, does the morality play a role when we think about, proper foreign policy decisions, or not? And is it all just power? How do you think about that?
Yeah. So for a realist, morality absolutely does not play a role, right? So what it is just about basic state interests and this identity, and it's clearly focused on states. It's one of the reasons why, for example, when you mentioned Mearsheimer, um, the role and the emphasis on states versus non-state actors. It's one of the reasons why also, there's also a blind spot you could argue among Americans. Now, some of this is not just ideological or an ideological perspective, but it's real political. So in Vietnam, for example, not wanting to identify the National Liberation Front, what the Americans call the Viet Cong, right? Vietnamese communists, as a homegrown insurgency. It can't be, right? Because from a realist perspective, it's North Vietnam conducting an invasion of South Vietnam. In fact, the United States didn't even want to call it a civil war in South Vietnam, right? So this was an externally inspired intervention by Hanoi taking orders from Moscow and Beijing, right? So I mean, it's hard in some ways to get that mentality across, but not really, because you're seeing it again today when you see, for example, discussions of Iranian proxies, right? So the fact that Hezbollah and Hamas and of course Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq or the Houthis in Yemen, that they're all just taking orders from Iran and this kind of great machinations. Surrealists will focus on states, and by that, state security, state interest, state power. And by power, it's often military force and economic force. And so these are kind of the key drivers. Where we see morality coming in, and this is often where you get this combination, what someone like John Mearsheimer will write, is that politicians talk like what you would say, a liberal internationalist, using claims of morality, focusing on democracy and good governance. But when they actually govern, they govern based as realists, based on state interest and state power. So morality doesn't come in. I think one of the other things that's often, it other than in political rhetoric, you'll hear it a ton of political rhetoric, and that's one of the things I try and get across is that in the book is there's also this idea, and this is where the title World of Enemies comes from, is that we're so it's deeply embedded in the civilizational discourse, right? We are civilized, the others are savage, right? There's this other that we are constantly demonizing as different or less than us. And so when we think about how every single conflict, whether it's Ho Chi Minh or Che Guevara to Arafat and or Yahya Sinwar today, and in between Saddam Hussein or Ayatollah Khomeini, you have this rogues gallery of evildoers, as President Bush used to call them. And so demonizing also plays a role in how we respond to them. So I think one of the other things that I think is probably important for your listeners to understand is that foreign policy is often very reactive, right? Very few presidents come in with a foreign policy strategy, and even if they do, they have to adapt it very quickly. Um, so you also get kind of a there can often be a bureaucratic inertia. I try and get some of that across in the book about, how the bureaucracy responds, how presidents and certain secretaries of state can really dominate the bureaucracy and push the kind of the policies they want. We're seeing that right now with Gaza, right, and the Biden administration. So the combination of Biden and Blinken really ignoring the experts they have in state, particularly on issues related to famine and development assistance. It's not the first time we've seen this. I mean, there's so many echoes. One of the things when we talk about, for example, Vietnam, was how much Johnson really picked the people he wanted to listen to. And those who may have offered a dissent were shut out, deliberately shut out. We see this again with the Bush administration in 2003 and the buildup to the war in Iraq and the conduct of the war in Iraq, that an echo chamber is created. And part of that echo chamber is this is what the president wants to hear and who he wants to hear it from. And so if you're not on board, you're out, right? So, we've seen this multiple times in different administrations. And so I think as part of that foreign policy strategy, developing that can often be one, it's reactive, two, it's often responsive to the election calendar in a way you would not expect of foreign policy, that the election calendar plays a role, and that includes midterms as well as the presidential elections, right? So that's one of the things I think that I try and get across in the book, and hopefully it comes through, is that we tend to think of kind of these great foreign policy strategists, and they come into Washington and they're going to do all these great things, and in fact, it's often responding to events and then responding to events in a quick haphazard way that often sets us up for the difficulties we encounter.
Yeah, it's also a strange piece of brilliant marketing, and I wonder if it's related to a kind of a perception that we have around expertise in foreign policy as civilians, voters, but the sense that um, Kissinger's a realist. He's not like one of those, pie in
Yeah,
the sky, unrealistic people, who are
right,
gonna, God forbid, to do something stupid. You know what I'm saying?
right,
Like
right,
he's, you and your morality, that's completely unrealistic. But
right,
Kissinger knows whatever that we're gonna bomb them into submission. You know what I'm saying?
right,
Which of course is
right.
exactly backwards. You
Right.
know?
Right. And I think what I try and get across in the book, particularly in the Nixon Kissinger chapter, is this, that Kissinger had a carefully cultivated public image. Okay. He leaked very strategically, especially against potential foes within the administration or those he was competing with. Okay. So he carefully cultivates this image of him as the brilliant foreign policy strategist, right? And thinker, and everything is based on realism. And in fact, I bring up a couple of examples in the book where you can see the exact opposite based on his own writing and the advice he's giving. He's often melodramatic. He often gives these apocalyptic, predictions that turn out not to be true. And whether that's Angola or it's Lebanon, whether it's the Palestinians or it's South Africa, this is, Kissinger has but in a way, it's also he's very selfish because this is what I want to see happen. This is the way I want the world to work, right? And this is how my strategy is going to work. And I'm not going to have these non-state actors come in and start to ruin that. They're going to do what I want them to do, X, Y, and Z. So it's very much an imperial vision you get from with all of those insecurities wrapped into it. And so one of the things I do hope that comes out of the book is that to start to chip away at the Kissinger myth that has been so carefully crafted. What's fascinating about Kissinger, and I'll throw this out, is that he's viewed differently today than he was in the 70s or 80s. And so he also went through a process of rehabilitation, some of it due to the post-Cold War era, but some of the people who actually saved his reputation were, in fact, ironically, Democrats, right? So here was a man who had served Republican administrations who had actually betrayed the Democrats in '68 by leaking to Nixon, right? So undermining Humphrey, undermining Johnson, and it's basically the Clintons who helped rehabilitate him. for their own kind of selfish purposes. So, that's a whole other book to be written. But I think that's important also for your listeners to understand that how these different individuals are viewed at different times, much like we think about the campus protest movement in the '60s or today's protest movement, or the fact that even before today, the largest anti-war protests since the Vietnam War occurred in response to the buildup of the invasion of Iraq. And that has been completely erased from history. So we don't talk about that. And in fact, much like you're hearing today, I can tell you 20 years ago that the protests were being dismissed as pro-Saddam, pro-terror, and this was from the quote unquote liberal voices. Uh, in response to one of the largest protests, if not the largest protest before the war, the quote unquote, liberal voice on, for example, the PBS News Hour, Mark Shields, says something to the effect of the people in the streets, they just did Saddam Hussein a favor, you know. Um, and you would have this constant drumbeat that these were people who didn't understand the way the world works, right? Didn't understand that all they were doing was giving aid and comfort, not just to the enemy, but to terrorists, were weakening America. And in fact, the people in the streets had a far more realistic view of what was about to happen than the Bush administration was selling, or that their allies inside and outside the administration were promising in the media. And in fact, one of the more detrimental aspects that comes out is when the invasion does not go as the Bush administration suggested. Weapons of mass destruction not found, and insurgency breaks out, and the American military is unprepared for this. The media will not go back to the anti-war voices. What the media will do is go back to individuals who had favored the war and had now turned against it
Right.
because they had credibility, right?
Right.
So they were credible voices. And so it was all about kind of how the war was executed. In fact, that in 2004, that's John Kerry's basic campaign is I will be a more effective commander in chief. I would have handled the war differently. I would handle the war on terror differently. And so, we see these threads throughout. And I try to pull those in.
Yeah, one of the things you said earlier about thinking about this realist school is the way they like to think in terms of states, and maybe there's a blind spot for non-state actors. And I think that ties into a section of the book which I found really, really important to me in terms of my understanding of the
Right.
world, which is about the Badlands.
Mm,
And maybe we'll come back to that because I have yeah, I want to sort of articulate sort of sort of kind of impression it left on me. But I guess maybe before we get to that, how do we fight the war on terror, though? So Israel,
mm,
for example, says we have a terror problem. America says we have a
right.
terror problem. What are we supposed to do? I mean, or you can't, right? You can't
Right.
negotiate with terrorists, right? That's
Right.
the a common assumption.
Right. Until
Right.
you do, which you eventually do. Right. So
Right.
this is also part of that demonization. Right. So I think what's so fascinating is, and it's one of the threads that runs through the book, is so, for example, you would see in the 1960s, you could pull newspaper accounts, New York Times, Washington Post, all describing Viet Cong terror. Okay. So the Viet Cong were terrorists committing acts of terror. And then you have a point by 1969, 1970, but definitely by 72, in which Palestinian acts of terrorism will be what defines terrorism, right? How do we think of what is terrorism, right? These high profile acts of terrorism, airplane hijackings, the attacks on the Olympics. And that will also lead into kind of the creation of a terrorism school, even though terrorism expert for the, really from the 70s through the 90s is a very small group, often tied to the different security sectors. The problem is in this broad brush of terrorism, and one of the things I kind of talk about in the book is you've effectively had, two mini wars on terror, one by Nixon, one by Reagan, and then the larger global war on terror adopted by the Bush administration. Is that invariably in this kind of this broad brush that's applied, it's actually limited U.S. ability to interact with these non-state actors. So, what do Nixon and Kissinger do? Nixon and Kissinger, in response to attacks by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or some of its offshoots, will negotiate basically a behind-the-scenes understanding. And so, one of the things that to Kissinger's credit he got was that, okay, what does the PLO really want? What does Yasser Arafat really want? They want relations with the United States. And Arafat himself is trying to present himself as a potential negotiating partner. Now, where I'm critical of Kissinger is that he dangles that and holds it out as long as possible, any kind of interaction with the PLO. And his mind is they're going to ruin any negotiation. I want to deal with states. So this is a common thread with how the U.S. deals with the Palestinians is we're going to negotiate around the Palestinians. We're seeing this again today, by the way, with the normalization agreements. We'll negotiate around them because they're the thorniest issue. And effectively, what we want to present them with is a fait accompli. This is what's left. This is what's for you to accept. So I run that thread through by the global war on terror under President Bush, and we could talk about the Reagan's mini war on terror, the successes, the failures, and how much of it is a template for President Bush. President Bush after 9/11 has options, but instead what he does, and I think this is where I'm most critical, is that we apply this broad brush to terrorist organizations with global reach as they'll be defined. And so what he does is we have a national security strategy that's put together that combines Al Qaeda, or Al Qaeda as most Americans call it, the Taliban, with groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others. All those are bunched under these groups of terrorist organizations with global reach, all of which the United States now deems the enemy and needs to be combated. And so part of the problem is by applying this broad brush, it actually confused the war on terror, you would say. And I would say it also leads to, an invasion of Afghanistan, the overthrow of the Taliban when there were other options available. Al Qaeda was very small. The response to 9/11 was a political response, an ideological response. It was not necessarily a military national security response, right? Because if it was actually a military national security response, we wouldn't be settling for things like, security theater at airports. We wouldn't be even 20 some years later searching less than 3% of cargo that comes into the United States, right? There were quick fixes that could be done. I mean, after all, Al Qaeda again was very small, and it was 19 hijackers armed with box cutters. They didn't represent a state or some massive empire. And in fact, what the Bush administration tried to do was, in continuously linking them to Iraq, was to say, oh no, there really was a state actor here, and further confusing, confounding it, and actually making this a global war, which was unnecessary and ultimately failed.
Yeah.
Does that
So
help? I mean, does that kind of
yeah,
does that get to your
yeah.
question? Yeah.
I guess there's sort of a blind spot. Like what you seem to describe in the book is the way in which terrorist
Right.
is such a powerful catch-all term. Um, I've had so many experiences. I mean, to put my cards on the table, I mean,
Right.
I grew up in a
Right.
right-wing Zionist community.
Right.
Um, and you say to people, like, what about this? What about that? And the word terrorist just solves like every problem. They're
Solves every
terrorists.
problem.
There's nothing else to discuss.
Right.
When in reality, my understanding of history is that the Haganah when Palestine was occupied by the British, which was the
Right.
Israeli forces, they blew up the King David Hotel, killing
Right.
90 people. They were terrorists. And in South Africa, Nelson Mandela used to be part of a terrorist organization. That one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That there's
Right.
variety and that there's political objectives. And it's this broad brush terrorist
Right.
is so counterproductive. It's a racist know nothing kind of approach to the world.
What's remarkable about it is if you pick up Menachem Begin's The Revolt, he addresses this directly, right? Fighting for your freedom is not the act of a terrorist, right? And if that's what makes me a terrorist, then I'm proudly a terrorist. So he directly addresses this in his book, right? And you'll have a counter, in a kind of one that tries to pick up on it. Abu Yad, who's one of the key figures in Fatah in the PLO, will write his own "My Home, My Land," in which he also kind of picks up on the Begin line, right? About also that we're no different than the Haganah, right? I think what's interesting when we talk about terrorism is what is terrorism and how vaguely and poorly defined that has been and was in the 70s and continues to be today. The fact that the State Department struggled with it. What's known as the Global Terrorism Index continues to struggle. It's the leading quote unquote terrorism specialist in the United States and globally continues to struggle with this definition. It's changed multiple times in just the past 5 years alone. and in response to political events. So, for example, the Global Terrorism Index will change its definition after the January 6th insurrection. It'll change it again 2 years later. Again, after October 7th, it'll change again. Um, so I think it's important for your listeners to understand that what we now call terrorism was often, indistinguishable from political violence. What distinguished a guerrilla from a terrorist? What distinguished an act of political violence from an act of terrorism? How much of this also, and this goes back to your earlier question, because we see in these examples how much non-state actors, different national, well, we call them non-state actors now, but national liberation movements of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, how much they copied and tried to learn each other, how much the Vietnamese and Algerian templates, plus the Cuban model, all inspired and informed what other national liberation movements were doing. So whether it is the Irish Republican Army, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the African National Congress, we're all looking to and learning from these prior models. And in fact, we're supported by them. You'll have training camps in Algeria. They will come in, both Mandela from the ANC and Arafat will go to the Algerian Independence Day parade. The Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese will also support these different groups, including the PLO. They will have contacts with the PLO. They have contacts with the ANC. And at the same time, this also takes us back to how we started with Nixon, is you're all as much as you're seeing these national liberation movements connected and communicating with each other and inspiring each other, there will be a conservative backlash in the United States, and of course with key allies, including South American dictatorships, Israel, South Korean dictatorships, and apartheid South Africa, saying we are effectively creating a unified front, a counter-revolutionary front against these groups. Okay. And that will fully bubble in by the 70s into the 80s, and really kind of help entrench a number of these dirty wars, not just in Latin America, but in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And I trace some of that out. So again, this idea, the other thing I think what's interesting for maybe your listeners to know is that how we talked about quote unquote terrorism during the Cold War will also change. One of the things that the United States will try and get across in the 70s and into the 80s is that terrorism was quote unquote inspired, right? They didn't want to deal with the root causes. So they wouldn't deal with the root causes of these different organizations. I deal with this a little bit in Reagan's mini war on terror. Who was inspiring terrorism? The Soviet Union, and then later after 1979, Iran. So if they could link it to a secular group, so say the PLO, or the ANC, which were secular groups that often had leftist members, sometimes communist or Marxist Leninist factions, they would say, okay, they're just taking orders from Moscow, maybe Beijing. If they were a religious group, particularly someone like Hezbollah's party, Lebanon's Party of God, right? Oh, well, they're just taking orders from Iran. So this was the way that in Washington, what you would get is the quote unquote the small clique of think tank experts would, and one of them is the current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will write about this, was how much of this was inspired by the Soviet Union or Iran, and that really what you needed was a Western alliance against these two twin foes, right? And he'll be writing about this in the 80s. He'll continue saying stuff like this later on. But often I think the most important thing that comes off is, and we'll see this repeated again and again, no desire to deal with the actual root causes, root grievances. How do you resolve them? And then the question, I deal with this in the book as well, because there's a domestic component, is how this connects, for example, instability in what comes known as the Jordanian Civil War, particularly the trigger for some of the triggers for it, including the hijacking by a Palestinian group of three airliners that are brought to Jordan, and then how that's discussed here in the U.S., which will link kind of these high-profile acts of terrorism to domestic discontent, domestic disturbances, whether it's the anti-war movement, the Black Panthers, whoever. So for mainstream voices in the press, and this should sound very familiar to your readers because you're hearing this almost exactly again today, is what links these terror attacks overseas to domestic disturbances here, and how is the U.S. responding to it or not responding to it, and how much does this show not of American strength but American weakness, that we can't respond to this in the right way, the way that they want.
They'll say it's because they hate our way of life. They're jealous of us.
Well, that will come next. That will come
Yeah.
next, right? They hate our way of life, right? So
Yeah.
that is what's interesting about, by the time we get to Bush and the global war on terror, this idea of they hate our way of life. And you'll hear this, for example, this where the Reagan administration, it's a bit, it's so much of a template, but some of that language will be created again. Like these revolutionaries, they're not really revolutionaries. We, the United States, are the true revolutionaries. They have a fake revolution. We have the real revolution. And the way to do is not through revolution, but through subtle, quiet reforms. Okay, that's how you fix these problems. It's not overturning the system; it's just tweaking the system. Okay, which is remarkable for a country founded on revolution. How much the United States adopts a counter-revolutionary stance throughout history, right? Particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries. The second piece is now, the Bush administration is going to kind of say one thing, but do quite another. It will try and claim, and I talk a little about this in the book, that this is not a war against Islam, right? All Muslims are not the enemy, right? And yet, in practice, and especially in the rhetoric of not just administration officials, but administration allies in the press, this is very much a war against Islam. Um, and that's why it's such a broad brush approach is applied with the global war on terror that I argue is ahistorical and an accurate assessment of the situation and ultimately wrong and failed.
Yeah. And I'm inclined to also, in addition, to reflect that back as human psychology for the citizens, And I remember 9/11 well. I was in eighth grade.
Yeah.
I remember it very well. I
Right.
remember the reaction very well. I remember a lot of what you came out talking about in your book, and that period of history I remember firsthand. And I remember the racism and the Islamophobia,
Yeah.
that just like you saw in the way the government policy operated in the mind of people who didn't know any Muslims in their own life, there was a painting with a broad brush.
Right.
There was a fear. Um, and
Or
and
even
that's
if they did know them, they now viewed them differently,
right,
which was
right,
which was
right,
another, which was
100%.
this other real,
Yeah.
difficult terrain to maneuver. Yeah.
Well, my world, my family, my community certainly didn't. We'd say that we were,
Right.
and so for us, they were,
Right.
and that's I think a human, part of our, I don't know, a capacity, let's say. It's a human
Right.
capacity. And I think overcoming that is very crucial to getting better outcomes, because the outcome of that is awful.
And so it's a great point. And I think we're seeing so much of what we're seeing today on college campuses, was in a sense very difficult to imagine in 2003, even especially in 2002, 2001, 2002, especially in the kind of the hard reaction to 9/11. It started to change in the build up to the war in Iraq, but especially, that Islamophobia is going to run really deep. You're talking almost a big generational shift now to where we are, from where we were in 2001, 2002. I wanted to come back to an earlier point you made, and I think this is also about, tapping into that kind of that racist identification. There's a moment I talk about in the book, where late in the Bush administration, where there's a renewal of the Patriot Act, and one of the things they want to fold in is the definition of narco-terrorism. And so one of the challenges will be, um, that the individual who helps write the statute doesn't define terrorism. And so when they get pushback from DOJ, Congress gets pushback from DOJ about what are we going to do with this? And the individual says, you know, we know what it is. We know what terrorism is. We've all seen it. It's flying planes into buildings, right? And it's like, well, okay, that I know that sounds great, right? And we know who it is and we know what it is and who's doing it, right? So again, to your point, that post 9/11 kind of zeitgeist, which was, who's the enemy, right? What do they look like? And of course, one of the things this triggers, and I think it's something other scholars have dealt with, um, is this initial reaction where it's anyone who quote unquote looks Muslim, right? So what does a Muslim look like? You're brown, right? Somehow, right? You're brown. You might have and that's all it is basically skin color, because it's not even about names. So what this actually led to, and when we talk about security theater, right, was the targeting anyone from South Asia broadly, right, as quote unquote a potential, and anybody who flew in and out of the United States in those days, all you had to do was kind of take a look at, who was being kept aside, for example, like at Heathrow Airport, um, in the security checks. Um, because it was just so overtly racist and based on just basic, not even based on name or any kind of intelligence or information. This was pure identification based on skin color. We also see attacks in the United States, and it's not the first time. This will ripple through in the United States. It'll ripple through, for example, in response to the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. "Quote unquote," anybody who looks Iranian will be attacked. And it's often invariably people who have nothing to do with this. Sikhs, anybody who wears any kind of headdressing will be attacked. Anybody who is brown. Some of the earliest people who were killed were Indian Americans and Sikhs, where that entire target, where the entire community was targeted and had nothing to do with this. Part of this is not just about the racial America's racial imaginary and what that means, but also this geographic imaginary. That all these places, sit
Yeah.
next to each other, right? So I think and then when we see that replicated in as I talk about in the book, in actual policies and in legislation, you see the real implications on the ground.
Yeah. So the right wing Zionist world, they have like these pithy kind of lines, that they
Right.
slogans that they like to throw around. So they'll say that the current protests on campus are pro Hamas.
Right.
How do we think about that? Where did Hamas come from? How should we understand
Oh, it's a
Hamas
great
and
understanding.
and
Yeah.
where it is today?
Yeah. So I talk about this a little bit in the book. But so one of the things that's going to happen is, Hamas is in one respect grows out of this very, this organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the oldest organizations in the Arab world. Started in Egypt, right, in the beginning of the 20th century, and then will very quickly become a very prominent political party in Egypt with a number of key members. After the Egyptian, quote unquote, revolution that brings Jamal Abdel Nasser to power, they will be identified as a threat. They'll be identified as a threat to the Egyptian military, even though some key members of the Egyptian military and the Egyptian ruling clique, including Anwar Sadat, are Muslim Brotherhood members. So in the 1950s, they'll be suppressed. A number of them will then leave Egypt, will flee. Some of those who don't end up in prison will flee Egypt. Many will end up in the Gulf. One of the things to remember is, so you see this really interesting linkage, not just about the region and about the role of religion, but for example, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, what's now known as the UAE, all of these countries have large, oil reserves, natural gas reserves, and are building their countries up. And of course, they need an education sector. So Muslim Brotherhood members will flee. They will end up becoming key elements, for example, in Saudi Arabia's secondary and then higher education institutions. Where we'll see them kind of reemerge is after Sadat becomes president of Egypt. He'll kind of give a broad amnesty, and the Muslim Brotherhood will come back into public life. There will be a kind of element of the loyal opposition, if you will. They will radicalize. A section of them will radicalize and become known as Egyptian Islamic Jihad. They will actually be involved in the assassination of Sadat. And then, of course, what you're going to start to see is by the 70s into the 80s, a broader trend across the region in which there's less identification with the secular governments, which are seen as having failed. So whether it's the Ba'ath Party in Egypt and Syria, or it's the mainstream party in Egypt, and we'll start to see a greater identification with Islamist politics and Islamist movements. So the Muslim Brotherhood being one of these. In the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood will start to gain strength in Gaza, and by the mid 80s. And they'll really fully emerge in the middle of what's known as the First Palestinian Intifada, which begins in 1987. And that's where we'll start to see them, start to actually creating members. Now, there's also a link with the insurgency in Afghanistan, right? So the Soviet Union will invade Afghanistan in 79, and the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others, and Pakistan will start to encourage broadly, including activists from the Muslim Brotherhood, to go to Afghanistan, be trained, and fight the Soviet Union. Some of them, the belief is it's going to be a one-way ticket. It's not a one-way ticket. In fact, they will go back. Some of them will go back, including members of what become Hamas, will go back to Gaza. So, one of the things that's important for your listeners to understand is as this is developing, Hamas is really small in 87. And, 86, 87, 88, but they will also be encouraged in their development by Israel, in part because Israel wants some kind of alternative to the secular PLO, right? And why is that important? Well, because at this point, by 86, 87, the PLO was recognized internationally. It is weak militarily, but it's actually diplomatically and politically, it's recognized by the UN, it's recognized by the Arab League. So Israel wants an alternative, right? It's also important to note that this is at this point roughly 20 years of occupation of the Palestinian territories. And what Israel has done and has been consistently doing is looking for alternatives to the PLO. In the West Bank, they'll try things like village councils. In Gaza, they'll try a couple of different alternatives. And then here comes Hamas. All right. So Hamas will start, during the first Intifada, will begin kind of collecting members and will present itself as kind of uh, a Muslim alternative to the PLO, right? Which is this secular uh, organization that includes communists, it includes Arab nationalists, it includes some Islamists, but not a lot. They're often generally part of one of the mainstream factions. Um, it won't really become a major player until the 90s and the Oslo Accords that are signed between the PLO and Israel in 1993, and then implemented over the course of the 90s, and then of course collapsed by the year 2000. Does that help? That's kind of a
Yeah,
broad
yeah,
history.
but
Yeah.
it gets I think it gets to this sort of tension which we've been touching on. I think it comes up in the book of like state versus non-state actors, and
Right.
this question which a lot of Zionists or people not necessarily Zionists, but they're focused on is who represents the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And how do you think about that? Because again,
Mm,
um,
yeah.
as someone who is not a Zionist. I don't consider
Right.
myself a Zionist, but is also steeped in that rhetoric. There's the
Right.
sense of this Hamas is the representative of the Palestinians because they won the
Yeah.
elections. How do you think about
Right.
that?
Right. So I think it's important to remember one, those elections were just parliamentary elections, right? And they were parliamentary elections that only represent the West Bank and Gaza, right? So it's not for the broader Palestinian diaspora. They don't get to vote. Um, it doesn't represent, for example, Palestinians who live inside Israel or Palestinians in the refugee camps outside. So that's one. One, those elections were a long time ago, and it was a narrow victory. So I think one of the things that's important to remember is when that election is held, you've had a couple of things that have kicked in. First is you've already had one presidential election, right, in which Mahmoud Abbas has been elected as Arafat's successor. Arafat dies in 2004, and then a few months later, an election is held, and Mahmoud Abbas wins. Okay, part of this is tied into, of course, as I talk about in the book, President Bush's own what he calls the freedom agenda, right? And so they want to push, the Bush administration wants to push these parliamentary elections. Um, and, you know, in a way, they think they're setting a trap for Hamas, right? Which is, okay, Hamas has kind of boycotted previous elections. We want to force them to kind of put up or shut up, right? To use the American expression, either participate in the elections or stop being a thorn in the side. So Hamas does not run on a platform of jihad, jihad forever. It runs on a platform of reform and change. So why is that important? Well, it's important because by the time that election's held, the Oslo peace process has has collapsed, and the Palestinian Authority, which is led by the mainstream Fatah movement, which is Arafat's party, Abbas's party, is now seen as corrupt. It's seen as ineffective. It's seen as collaborating with the occupation and benefiting from Israel's occupation. So when Hamas talks about reform and change, Hamas has also built up a reputation for not being corrupt, for having effective social services in a way that the Palestinian Authority doesn't. And the reality is, Fatah is also divided. It's one of the reasons why in the election, Hamas is able to win narrowly because in part the Fatah vote is split and the Palestinian left has been completely enervated. If you were to hold, so this is the response to your question. If you were to hold an election today, and it was not just the West Bank and Gaza, but all Palestinians, would Hamas win? Hamas would probably win again at least 40% of the vote. Okay. The problem you have there is how much would the Palestinian left win? Would they win 10%, 20%? Is this a parliamentary election? Is this a presidential election? Who are the candidates is also a question. Obviously, if it's Mahmoud Abbas, already the polling is indicates that like a vast majority of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, not the diaspora, want Abbas to resign, right? So they want a new leadership. They want some kind. Who that new leadership is, unclear. Is it Barghouti who's in prison? Is it Mahmoud Dahlan who's in exile and backed by the UAE? Who is it? Unclear. Um, so to claim that Hamas is the voice of the Palestinians is it's a tough claim to make. The problem now is after now 6 to 7 months of just this horrendous onslaught, right, in which the declared aim was the destruction of Hamas. And in fact, but on the ground, not only has that not been achieved, but if you wanted to destroy Hamas, you wouldn't do it this way, right? You wouldn't do it in the manner that the Israelis have conducted this operation.
It surely just strengthens Hamas.
What's that again? Yeah,
It surely just strengthens them.
exactly, absolutely. I mean, you can't create 17,000 orphans and then say we want to eliminate Hamas, right? Um, you can't kill predominantly women and children, target doctors, professors. This strengthens Hamas. And look, Hamas has a lot of questions it has to answer because you have this real split within Hamas between the political wing, which is external. So someone like Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar, who was internal, right, who's in Gaza and was the mastermind of the October 7th attack, right? So the question now becomes, because they're going to have very difficult questions to answer, right? And they've tried to deal with some of this in some of their public statements, which is what did you expect to achieve? Did you achieve that? And did you expect this kind of reaction? And they've already said we did not expect this kind of reaction from Israel. Should they have? And we definitely didn't expect this kind of reaction from the United States. All right. So already there's a misjudgment. Now, it's going to be very difficult with the bomb still falling to kind of have this assessment, right? And kind of this judgment, but that is coming. At the same time, if you were to hold the election and Hamas has actually, in a sense, because the way they will present it is that we stood up to the Israeli war machine, we stood up to the United States, we stood up to all the great powers ourselves, just a bunch of guys in tracksuits running around with RPGs, right? Meanwhile, the Arab world was against us, everyone was against us, and we stood up, and we fought, and we held firm with our resistance. So they will rely on that. Will that be enough? So I think the bigger story is also this: is that when in response to the question about who represents the Palestinians, what Palestinians have consistently said since roughly 2005, and I talk a little about this in the book, is they want a national unity government. They want Fatah and Hamas to end this split between them that has been that is internal and externally promoted. So the United States and Israel are absolutely against a unified national unity government, right? But you have multiple agreements from 2005 to, I mean, most recently 2022, 2023 that have been negotiated between Fatah and Hamas that have never been implemented. Okay. Now, who has this benefited? One of the people that's benefited obviously is Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu has encouraged this split, right? They've kept this split going. It's one of the reasons why he was encouraging Qatar and Turkey to continue getting money into Gaza pre-October 7th to help build Hamas up, keep Hamas and Gaza separate from the West Bank and Fatah, keep Fatah in the West Bank kind of weak, divided, but Hamas really suppressed also in the West Bank. And in Gaza, keep Hamas in power and Fatah suppressed and divided, right? So you can see the machinations at play. And at the same time, the U.S. has endorsed this. The Biden administration never wanted to deal with this. What the Biden administration has wanted, and this was on display in May 2021, shortly after Biden came into office, we want to focus on normalization agreements. We want to focus on post-COVID, economic recovery, building on Trump's normalization agreements with bringing the Saudis in, and then we'll deal with the Palestinian issue at the end, if ever. Okay, and after that, once you have the invasion of Ukraine, Israel Palestine's on the back burner, right? This is not something we never intended to deal with this to begin with, and now it is absolutely not a priority, right? So this allowed and really allowed Netanyahu to kind of really continue this policy that he had been he had done throughout his entire term as, for example, as prime minister, but he was building on his predecessors with it.
Yeah, I think also the Israeli government has a lot of first of all, I think media has reported on the role that the Israeli government has played in sort of propping up Hamas, and
Yeah.
I'm not well versed in that, but on a more just simplistic policy level,
Right.
like when you look at the March of Return, which were these generally peaceful protests for months and months and months, and if
Right.
if there's no concession, if there's no acknowledgement, if there's no people,
Yeah.
I believe respond to incentives. I believe people are going to fight through whatever means they
Yeah.
see as efficacious. And
Right.
we have historically this months long massive popular protest in Gaza, which resulted in it was completely ignored and resulted in mass tragedy for Gazans who were maimed in the process. So when you do things like that, you're pushing people into a corner. You're giving them fewer and fewer options.
Right.
And if Israel wanted a more peaceful partner, then they would have to have made concessions to, for example, peaceful protest, to start with,
So I think you make a great point. I think one of the other things I would try and do, and I bring this a bit in the book, is that you have successive military incursions. So, keep in mind, if you talk to Palestinians in Gaza, they will tell you that the siege, they saw elements of the siege first begin really in 2003. So in the middle of the Second Intifada, right? It was heightened after Israel's withdrawal in 2005. That's really when the siege kicks in, and then amplified after Hamas took over in June 2007. So from June 2007 to October 7th, 2023, right? Gaza has been under siege. Um, the past really 3 to 4 years, what you've seen is kind of, Netanyahu's game of trying to really kind of continue to build up Hamas in Gaza. And one, because it helps him delay, because this goes back to your previous question, it helps him delay any potential negotiations. We haven't had firm negotiations, real negotiations since 2014, since Obama was president. Okay. And that's between the Abbas and Netanyahu, not even including Hamas. But in between, if you think about it, from 2008, you had the major Israeli attack when Ehud Olmert was still prime minister, invasion of Gaza. Another one in 2012, 2014, then 2021, and now today. Now, at the end of those, there's a ceasefire that's reached. But what's happened is what Hamas will tell you is Israel has never kept its terms of the ceasefire. The siege was never broken. They continue to tighten and loosen as they see fit, letting in a minimal amount of, food and supplies in. There's an active black market that gets goods into Gaza, and at the same time, Israel has continued to conduct, assassination airstrikes of whether it's Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or whoever as they see fit. In fact, one of the things that's been underreported was in May 2023, so several months before uh, the October 7th attacks, was Israel had killed in an airstrike several key figures in Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and there was no response. They were on their way. They were supposed to go to Egypt as part of an Egyptian broker negotiation, and they were assassinated. And so created some tensions between Egypt and Israel over this, which was, these guys were coming here. You knew they were coming here, and you killed them. So PIJ did not respond, but then because they were waiting for October 7th to respond. So it's one of these things where, you're going to hear a couple of things like, well, some of this is, of course, repeating Netanyahu's kind of framing, which is, I don't have anybody to talk to. Hamas is ISIS. The Palestinians are divided. And until they're united, I can't talk to anybody. Right. And even if I talk to them, I'm against the Palestinian state anyway. So stop bothering me. Right. There won't be a Palestinian state as long as I'm prime minister. So you get you get several different levels of this discussion. The second piece, the second thing that's kicked in is this language about, well, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. It's like, yes, there was a ceasefire on October 6th that has been consistently broken by Israel, dating back to 2008, if not before, right? And so, part of this is, is a deliberate attempt by the media and in the United States, as well as the State Department, the U.S. State Department, to basically kind of obscure the reality on the ground. The third thing I'll bring in, I think you made a good point about this, is you have taking us back to the collapse of the Oslo Accords, the summit in 2000, right, where Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak meets with Yasser Arafat, and negotiations brokered by President Clinton. They fail. But the negotiations continue, and then you have the second Palestinian Intifada breakout. Negotiations will continue even as the Intifada is unfolding. Um, but what's happened is that the Clinton administration was blamed Arafat, right? So, and I should talk about this in the lead up to the negotiations, to the summit rather. When Clinton approached Arafat to come and do the negotiations, from what we understand, Arafat said to him, "Look, we're not ready. Barak's government has not been negotiating in good faith. They haven't even been meeting with us. So all the preliminary stages have not been met. And the summit's going to fail. And if it fails, you're going to blame me." And he gets a promise from Clinton that he won't blame him. The summit fails, and the first thing Clinton does is blame Arafat, right? And there's reasons for that. It's an election year. His wife is running for a Senate seat in New York. His vice president is running for president. And then there's other aspects as to why Clinton's going to blame Arafat. He's the easiest one to blame. They also want Barack. Barack is politically weak. They want Barack to win re-election, and the negotiations are continuing. Nevertheless, one of the key threads, and we just heard this from Secretary of State Blinken earlier this week in an interview, I believe, with the BBC, where you've heard this repeated by Clinton era officials and then other Democrats, was the myth of the generous offer. Well, the Palestinians walked away in 2000. They were offered this generous offer in 2000, and that destroyed the peace process. And so, really, all this goes back to 2000. And had they just accepted, everything would be better now. And it's a remarkable way to approach diplomacy. It's a remarkable way to approach the peace process, because you make it sound like diplomacy is a take it or leave it
Right.
sale, right? Of like you're selling mattresses, right? If you don't buy this car today, the deal is off, right? And we'll never return to this. It's never available to you again. That's not the way diplomacy works, right? And that it's so disingenuous. And this is not the way negotiations achieved, right? And we have a great example of it. For example, to take us back to the beginning of the conversation, which is in Vietnam. We had the outline. We actually had the agreement, the eventual agreement between North Vietnam and the United States in October of 1972, a month before the election. Okay, so this is Nixon's reelection. Nixon doesn't want the agreement. He holds off on the agreement. He tables it. And instead, the election comes. He's reelected by a landslide. He will launch what's known as the Christmas bombing. So it's this massive bombing of North Vietnam. And the idea is, I'm going to get concessions. And we actually have him talking to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and telling him, this is your chance to win the war. This is your chance to win the war. I want you to bomb them and the idea that he's going to get some additional concession, something. Meanwhile, Kissinger starts leaking to the press that we have a deal. We have a deal that Nixon doesn't want. The Christmas bombing doesn't achieve anything, right? In fact, just kills a lot of people. American pilots are shot down. Some are captured, some are killed. And in the end, the same deal that's signed, right, in January of 73 is the same one that was available in October of 72. That should tell us something. It should tell us about kind of the combination of military force and diplomacy. It should tell us something about kind of the disingenuous use of language. It also tells us something about kind of what's going on here between Biden and Blinken when it applies to this conflict, and how, when we start hearing things like extraordinarily generous, extremely generous, the reality is quite different.
Yeah, I'm mindful of our time here, but I say one of the
Yeah,
pieces of the book which I think had the biggest, I don't know, impact on me. Obviously, I learned a lot from the book. That goes without
right,
saying, but just sort of shaping worldview and modeling
right,
the world was this element of the Badlands
right.
and this sense, this mythology, this imagination of a frontier of lawless, godless, tribal, anarchy, and the way in which that was deployed during the Nixon administration to talk
Yeah,
about the inner cities and the drugs, like these like no-go zones,
right.
and what that serves, the function of that mythology,
Yeah,
and when you said in the book, like sort of almost in passing, like in a fairly that, and this is sort of what the way Israel now thinks of the west of Gaza as not being
yeah,
occupied. It's just the Badlands after Hamas
yeah,
takes over. Um, and I'll just point out, I'll make another connection to a different book which I
yeah,
which I talked about. This is a book which is geared for an Israeli readership. It's by one of the
right.
former heads of the Shin Bet, and he talks about in the book
Yeah,
how the advantage of Hamas. He's saying this was a disaster for Israel, but
Yeah.
when Hamas took power, we were able to just delegitimize the entire Palestinian movement and say it's just
Yeah.
they devolved into Somali like turmoil,
Right.
violence. It's the Badlands or not.
Right.
We have no
Right.
and that lens of thinking, which I think is so powerful, and also ultimately damaging, ultimately
Right.
a disastrous way of thinking about the world.
Well, I appreciate that. And thanks for the kind comments. Yeah, I think the thing about the Badlands is it draws on this myth and mythology of the American West that becomes incorporated into American military and then American political thinking. So, when the American military refers to these no-go areas as Indian country, right? It's drawing on that same mythology. The fact, as I talk about when I open the book, this idea that Bin Laden is codenamed Geronimo, right? I mean, how much that infuses kind of American military notions. And then what you get is by the Prohibition era, the application of this idea of the Badlands to these crime-ridden areas, the South Side of Chicago or other neighborhoods, um, and then applied to other urban areas by the time we get to the later wars on drugs. And then eventually after 9/11, they reemerge in Afghanistan, Pakistan. It's applied to Gaza. It's applied to Somalia. It's applied to Yemen. And what it does to the point you just made is that you are now casting this net, whether they are domestic urban populations or they are populations overseas, that these are not just no-go zones, but they are inhabited by people who, at a minimum, give tacit support to the activities that are done there, right? If not, actively participating in whether it is drug running, it is, drug sales, it is terrorism, it is, so when we start talking about, and this is exactly what, Gaza will be labeled a Badlands. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice will call it, we'll say Hamas turned Gaza into a terrorist wasteland, right? You know, but as we should have known then, as we now know, there are 2.3 million people there, right? The vast majority are children, right? How are you labeling one of the most densely populated places in the world a terrorist wasteland in which 50% of the population are children, right? It gets back to your earlier question about the election. The children who were born have nothing to do with that election from 18 years ago, right? It's and so what I really also wanted to get across to the readers is we are making certain decisions when we rely on military force in place of diplomacy. When our Secretary of State is sitting in the Israeli War Cabinet, it's one of the things that's been underreported. Why is the Secretary of State in the Israeli War Cabinet? Why is the Secretary of State a week after October 7th sending out memos across the State Department that we're not going to talk about a de-escalation, we're not going to talk about a ceasefire? The Secretary of State is America's top diplomat. He's not supposed to be in the War Cabinet. That's why you send the Secretary of Defense or the Assistant Secretary of Defense if there's that level of coordination. Secretary of State is supposed to be doing something different. He's not the first one to do stuff like this, right? I talk about Mike Pompeo. I talk about Colin Powell. So the fact that the American Secretary of State has become, one of the leading hawks, while the Secretary of Defense is often put in the role of the moderate, is this remarkable turn in the post-Cold War era that, we've only seen a few times during the Cold War, but Vietnam was one of them with Dean Rusk, right? But it's a remarkable turn that should trouble all Americans. The other aspect here is what it means when we're making these choices domestically, when we write off large sections of our cities as irredeemable, right? That we can do nothing about them, that they're deeply entrenched. This whole thing, during the 80s and 90s, there was this kind of now dismissed notion, the notion of the culture of poverty, right? And this again ties back to that civilizational rhetoric that we opened with. So when we're making specific choices, when our anti-missile defenses cost 10 to 100 times what it costs the Houthis to fire a drone or a missile, and we're engaging with them at that level, that's money we're not spending on schools, we're not spending on public health infrastructure, we're not spending on basic infrastructure. When you think about all the problems the United States has, right? Here we are, the richest, most powerful nation in the world, and yet there's no universal health care. There's no universal daycare. We have a housing crisis. We have a retirement crisis. We have an elderly care crisis. All of which And what we've chosen instead, and I think is one of the other lessons of October 7th, shortly after, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, is asked, can the United States afford wars to support wars in Ukraine and Israel? Knee-jerk response, absolutely. Absolutely. But what I want your listeners to think about is, especially the younger group who are now facing the impact of climate change, student loan debt, unaffordable housing, unaffordable university education. Why is it that we can always afford and absolutely afford wars, but we can't afford anything else? What else have we been told in the past 4 years by the Biden administration or the Trump administration? We can't afford that. We can't afford this. We can't afford that. But we can afford war. Right. And I think it's, we opened up, and again, I'll bring it back because I think some of those initial October 7th reactions or the reactions to Ukraine are really telling. When President Biden, after launching airstrikes against Yemen, against the Ansar Allah in Yemen, is asked, "Are they working?" and he says, "No." Will they continue? Yes. That effectively sums up the foreign policy I've described in the book, right? We're going to continue doing this, even though we know it's not working, because we don't believe there's another option. We're going to continue supporting war and at the same time telling the American public that we can't afford to do anything else, right? So those are some of the remarkable and tragic lessons coming out of the Vietnam War, but it's also one that I'm hopeful that will start to change if a younger generation starts to identify that this is not a policy that speaks for them, and they can recognize these failures over 6 decades, and as they're continuing today.
Wonderful. Well, I would love to talk more, but
Sure.
we'll end it here.
Okay.
I highly recommend the book to anyone, A World of Enemies. I think it's super important read.
Thank you.
Dr. Khalil, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks so much.